Good evening. We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News, and I've been looking forward to this one. Our guest is Matt Gagnon, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Maine Policy Center, which is a conservative think tank here in Maine. There are other similar think tanks in other states across the United States and, of course, nationally as well. Welcome, Matt.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
This is not Matt's first rodeo here. I think he's been here 4 or 5 times. We've been doing this 17 years, and our guest tonight has been here more times than anyone in the history of this show. And that's because I'm a fan of his. We don't agree on much, but I'm a fan of his, and he's a very thoughtful guy and a very forthright fellow, and I always like to have him on to hear about the conservative viewpoint and conservative politics, and it's not something, a political view we share, but I try to understand it. And in fact, I will say, and you'll find this out as we go along, there are certain things where I agree with him. And he doesn't have to say it because he has a constituency. There may be a couple of things he agrees with me on.
I'm happy to admit that. That's okay.
So, Matt, why don't you remind the folks of a little bit of your background. First, talk about the organization, the Maine Policy Center, and what it does and how long it's been around.
Maine Policy Institute has been around now for, I guess, 23 years. It was 2002, right after the 2002 gubernatorial race between John Baldacci and Mr. Chinquette. After that was done, they actually founded the organization that December. So it's been around since then, and as you pointed out, it's similar to a lot of organizations that you find in states across the country. Over the course of 23 years now, we've been involved in public policy fights on everything from taxes to healthcare to education, and kind of involve ourselves in all issues. But we've always described ourselves predominantly as a free market policy think tank. A lot of people infer conservatism or libertarianism or an ideology and perspective there, but really we believe in limited government and free markets, and that's the thing that we primarily focus our attention on.
So, as for yourself, how did you get it? You went to University of Maine, and then did you go to Washington right after that?
I did. I went to Washington right after college, and I worked down there for about 10 years in politics. And it's interesting, if you look at my career, about half of it so far has been in campaigns, elections, candidates, the world of the actual politics that most of us obsess over when we watch TV and read the news. And the other half of it has been actually outside of that. The think tank universe is very divorced in many ways from candidates and campaigns. In fact, I would say at any given time, a candidate or an elected official in Augusta is actually mad at me on my own side of the aisle just as much as someone on the other side is, because we don't really have much of a connection to those people that are running for things. I don't have to convince a constituency to vote for me, so I can just focus on an idea and whether or not I believe in that idea and whether or not our group is trying to advocate for that idea. And if somebody doesn't, then we'll say so.
So you're stimulating ideas, thinking about things, thinking about policy in a more abstract way, and they are worried about votes.
I think you could probably classify it exactly like that.
I explain to people, my wife particularly, who gets really worked up about politics these days, wondering why the Republicans in the Senate, for instance, don't take on Trump very much. And I said, because that's where the votes are. I mean, these guys and women all have to run for re-election. I would say Susan Collins is less worried than others, maybe, other Republicans, because she understands her constituency is a little bit different. And so she doesn't have the same problem.
I think you'll find that in all politicians, honestly, across the partisan divide, Democrats, Republicans, they all sort of operate like that. Whatever the prevailing wind is in their party, they tend to drift with it. If you look at the Democratic Party, it's grown much more progressive over the years, and the activist base of the party has absolutely been leading around a lot of their senators too. It's just kind of the
Now
nature
they're
of the
going to
beast.
start the same thing. The vice chairman of the Democratic National Committee, newly elected, says we got to start primarying these Democrats because they're not pure enough. And
right.
It's all about purity, and it seems to be working. And I think there has to be some structural change in how we nominate people to eliminate that. But I don't know how you do it, and we're not going to get into that.
Yeah, that could be its own show, I would imagine.
So tell us a little bit about what your think tank does. I mean, how 5 days a week, we're in the middle of the week. What are you doing over there?
There's a lot of things. I mean, it's a varied profession that we have. I would say a good part of it is research and analysis. We just put out a new report about 2 or 3 weeks ago on the housing crisis that's in Maine right now, and trying to answer the question of exactly what policy does to cost and availability for homes, because that's ultimately what's going on in Maine is we don't have enough of them and the cost is too high. So we partnered with an economist from Colby College, James Ciodla, who helped us do an economic analysis to try to put numbers to things like rent control and inclusionary zoning, minimum lot sizes, and all the things that affect cost and availability. That project took us a good 5 or 6 months to actually complete. So it was a big lift. It ended up being something like 60 pages in the end. So we do a lot of that. We've had other reports on energy, other reports on education. We also do a lot of things that are more day-to-day. For instance, today I had 3 of my employees working on testimony to the legislature on a variety of bills. As you know, there's 2,000 or so bills every year, and we don't weigh in on every one of them, but when they're in our core areas of responsibility that we care about for policy issues, we will make our opinion known about it. And so we'll craft testimony if necessary. We'll show up in Augusta and deliver it there, but they do Zoom now, which is interesting, so you can do it from a distance also.
Yeah.
But really, that's all about trying to help in the short term the people who have been elected to lead us in the legislature to make decisions that are more rational. I mean, ultimately, politics is an irrational business, and people operate on feelings and the passions of voters and whatnot, and things are right or wrong economically. Things are right or wrong from my perspective on questions of governance. And I think providing a perspective to the leaders and trying to sober them up a little bit and get them outside of that emotional bubble is something that a think tank like ours is really charged with.
Back to the housing crisis, did you reach any conclusions as to what might alleviate the housing crisis? What the problem is?
The answer to the housing crisis in Maine and the housing crisis in California, the housing crisis everywhere, is to build more units. You're dealing with a supply and demand misalignment. There's a lot of people that want something, and there's not enough of that something. And something is housing, so rents, homes to purchase, that kind of thing. Maine, I believe the report that was produced by the state government last year said that in just the next decade, they're going to need something in the neighborhood of 85,000 houses built across the state just to keep up with the current demand for housing, to say nothing of any population growth.
Are we going to have 85,000 new residents of Maine?
That's our current gap. We're short of that now, is kind of the point. If we have population growth, we're going to have to, just to keep up with where we are today, build that. And we don't. We build significantly less than that. And that's largely because most communities in Maine, particularly the larger places that you could build in, are very hostile to development projects. They make them more expensive, they make them less profitable, they make them less likely, and they make them more expensive when they do happen. So honestly, the real quick answer to you is that towns and communities across the state have to start saying yes to things. They have to be more willing to take the barriers that are in the way of building more homes away and allow it to happen.
What are the barriers, Matt? Zoning?
Yep. Zoning is absolutely a huge part of it, particularly certain types of zoning and certain rules within those zones. But it's also, Portland is a classic example of this. Mm-hmm. Portland is probably the area that needs to be the freest and the most open because it has the largest population demand. So they have done everything wrong. If you look at our report, you have one policy after another that makes housing cost more and makes it less available. So when you do that, you have not nearly enough things being built in your city that need to be, if you want to. So what's happening is the demand is now being pushed out to some of the surrounding communities, And not all of them are all that interested in building either, but some of them are.
Yeah.
So you're not getting enough in Portland, you're getting some in the surrounding communities, and it's just being diffused out at a much lower rate than it really should be. If you were to take away rent control, inclusionary zoning, and minimum lot sizes in, say, the city of Portland and some of the surrounding communities, you would solve it, I wouldn't say overnight, but in a very short period of time, you'd actually have very large construction projects that would be able to solve this problem for a lot of the state.
And some of the problem, I think, in line with your thinking, is that politicians, many in Portland, think that they know about development. Look, this is a
Right.
free market. It costs money to build housing. And, you know, labor costs are high, material costs are high. So you got to take that into consideration when you create things. And if you want them to, somebody wants to build an apartment complex, and you want them to pay the city so much for every low-income unit that you don't produce, somebody's going to pay that cost.
Yeah.
And it's going to be in rents. Somebody else is going to pay
And
it.
that's assuming it ever gets built. I mean,
Yeah.
I've talked to a lot of folks who are in not a sort of large developer situation, but they might just be individuals that might like to buy a building or build something to rent out so that they can have something for themselves to save for retirement or have some property that they have. And to a person, none of them want to own anything in Portland because they know that with the rent control rules the way that they are, there is no possibility that they can make any kind of money on it. So when you have people making decisions not to buy and not to build, the availability goes down. And availability going down means demand increases and there's less supply and price goes up.
All right, let's move on to where we're supposed to be going with this.
By all means.
And I was going to ask you to tell us what your definition is of conservative government, of conservative politics. Now, you're smiling at me
I
like
am.
this. Why is the guy asking me a question like that?
No, it's an excellent question. I actually think it's the question. And I think it's not just about conservative politics. I think it's about all of the definitions that we use.
Yeah, of course.
I really
yeah.
do.
Okay, so I'm going to make some notes.
So to quickly try to start answering you, I think that I would begin by suggesting to you that there's really no such thing as conservatism. If you look at the Republican Party, which is the vehicle through which most people think conservatives operate, you look inside that party, you have a whole bunch of different types of political ideology. You know, I could probably name 4 or 5 of them off the top of my head. You have sort of a very moralistic, religious conservative constituency where people are, you know, in the old Jerry Falwell right that you might think of, right? Maybe the Mike Huckabees of the world, that kind of person. You have the Chamber of Commerce, kind of traditional establishment conservative folks, maybe the Mitt Romney wing, if you might want to call it that. You have the populist nationalist group, which is, of course, I think the biggest and largest and most influential one now. That's the Trump party, if you will. You have libertarians, right? You have the Rand Pauls of the world and the Thomas Masseys of the world, those types of folks who agree with a lot of the populists but disagree in a lot of places. If you were to draw it in a
How would
diet,
you define the Rand Pauls? I missed that.
that would be sort of a fusionist libertarian kind of, kind of group. They're not pure libertarians because they're participating in the Republican Party, and by nature, that means they're compromising on some things, but they're definitely a different person. I mean, if you've been watching what's been going on in Washington, Rand Paul has been, and I'm just using him as an example, he's been apoplectic about everything that's going on with trade, especially, but also some things related to due process and law. And that is a conflict with the populist right. So my point in saying all this is if you were to draw conservatism or the Republican Party, however you want to define it, in a Venn diagram, you'd have a lot of bubbles, and there's a lot of crossover in those bubbles, but there's also a lot of things that are not crossing over.
And I want you to continue because I'm enjoying this. And the same thing with the Republican Party. I mean, the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
Same thing. I mean, I don't have much in common with what I hear from the Democratic Socialists or from the Portland City Council. And I disagree with so much of it. But they want to have 2 broad tents in this country to enable people, to give them a path to get elected to public office. Maybe that'll change someday.
No, I doubt it. I'll say why, though, because you know, a political scientist would tell you that the American system with 2 parties is really like a European multi-party system. with coalitions being the parties. Like if you go to Germany, right?
Yeah.
They're currently going through a little bit of a thing.
Yeah,
They have
yeah.
a new chancellor as of yesterday, finally, after like 4 months of negotiations. And that happened because they had to have the plurality party, who had won the election but didn't have over 50% of the vote, had to find some way of getting enough people to be on the team to be a part of a governing coalition. So in Europe, you don't have these big tent parties, but you kind of do, because in order to govern, you actually create these groups that kind of walk together. And all that happened in the United States was those groups went under the tent of each party. So on the left side, you have a very populist left, the Bernie Sanders people, who actually cross over with Trump on things, which is fascinating.
Right, we want to get to that because that is a fact, and I've talked about it on this show, the crossover. Go ahead.
It is, but you also have sort of ultra-progressive liberals who are in the party. You have, I think, what you would probably be defined as, which would be kind of an old left, sort of free speech advocate, somebody who believes in markets but wants to soften them on the edges, that type of thing.
Yeah.
There's fewer of those folks left, but they're still there. But there's multiple coalitions.
But wait. This isn't where I was intending to go with, but I find this very, very, very interesting. If I were to describe myself, I would say I have become aware over the years of focused on human nature, and this belief that human beings, they have their good parts, but forever, and it's immutable. Human nature doesn't change. It's the same as it was when we were in caves. And we tend to want to dominate. We have a lot of fear of others. We're very careful about strangers and so forth. The strong tend to exploit the weak. We have a lot of weak people. We have a lot of strong people. We have physically able people and not physically disabled people. We have people with mental illness, and we have people who are emotionally sound. We have all this conglomerate, and it's normal, it's natural, and it would exploit one another. And I believe that government comes together because all of these people have to live in a society. They're all different, and we have to somehow live in a society without getting in each other's way and without harming one another. And so that's the only reason we have to have a government. If, as Madison said, if we're all angels, we wouldn't need a government. And so I'm a Democrat because I believe that all of this has to be moderated. Mm-hmm. I believe that Pablo Casals one time there was a television show with Pablo Casals conducting training a youth orchestra in Puerto Rico. I saw it 50 years ago, and I've never forgotten what he did. They were practicing, this was on PBS, they were practicing, he banged his baton and stopped. And he said to the students, "You must understand, good music is like good government. Freedom, but with order." And I've always felt that politics is about where you are in the spectrum, freedom and order, and it's fluctuating all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a Democrat because I believe that you do have to protect the weak from the strong. And that's basically my thought. So you got me right.
I know a lot of people like you. I do. I think what's fascinating, I think, about what's happening in both parties right now is that what used to be considered a Republican and what used to be considered a Democrat is very much changing.
Totally.
And a lot of this is repetitive in American history. If you're a student of history, you know that at various times over the course of the last 200 plus years, different sort of ideologies have been dominant in the parties. If you go back and you read a book on Grover Cleveland, which, by the way, you should. It's a good one I read about 6 months ago.
One just came out, yeah.
Yeah, there's one called Man of Iron that I read. It was fantastic. I loved it. But Grover Cleveland would hang out with Rand Paul today. I mean, they had a very similar philosophy on a small, limited government, had very similar views on most issues. But right after Grover Cleveland, you had the Progressive Era, and then the next Democratic
Teddy
president.
Roosevelt, McKinley, then Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, he did, but the next Democratic president was Woodrow Wilson, who was the guy who really started the process of moving the Democratic Party towards more progressive politics, which then FDR really took and ran with and reshaped the coalition. But afterwards, you had both parties that changed significantly in a variety of ways. The old right, pre-World War II, looked very much like what Trump is talking about now. It was very populist, very nationalist,
Right.
isolationist on foreign
Isolationist.
policy,
Yeah.
didn't want to get us involved in foreign wars. Pre-World War II, they were peaceniks. They didn't want to really involve ourselves in Europe's war. And then, you know, you had that seminal event that changed a lot of people's attitudes about things, and then suddenly they
Pearl
became
Harbor.
a great deal more open to foreign involvement. So my only point is that these things change over time, and what you're living through, and I think a lot of people on the Republican side are living through, is that you're looking around in the room right now, and a lot of the people that used to be there aren't there anymore, and there's a lot of new people in the room, and you're not really 100% sure about them yet. You're trying to figure out exactly, you know, do I belong here, do I not? That's a question that a lot of people are asking. You said to me before we got on today that, you know, folks in like Aroostook County and some of the more rural areas of Maine, you used to hang out with those people, and it would be, you know, a Democratic party meeting, right? It was, and my whole family was like that, right?
Yeah.
They worked in paper mills and lumber and that type of thing around Lewiston, Auburn, and Aroostook County, and they were all Democrats because they were French and they were workers, right? But all of those people today, all of those people today are Republicans.
They elected Edmund Muskie.
Yeah, they did. And they also elected Donald Trump and Paula Page.
And they did indeed.
And there's a lot of change happening.
You mentioned something earlier that I found very interesting because I have mentioned it on this show. You said Bernie Sanders is a populist. And so there's crossover between Trump voters and Bernie Sanders voters. And one time when the Tea Party thing started, movement started, I think it was, I forget when, 2007 or 8. No, it was when Obama.
It was around Obama, yeah.
It was when Obama
It really
became
took off
president.
in 2009, I'd
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
And so I said to my producer here, Leslie, let's find the guy or person who thinks they're the leader of the Tea Party movement in Maine. So we found a guy, graduate of Colby College, very nice man, he's passed on now, died very young. But he was a good guy, and I had him on. So I listened to him, and then a year or two later, we had Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
And so I said to Leslie, find the person who thinks they're the leader of Occupy Wall Street. And about halfway through the Occupy Wall Street guy's interview, I said, well, you know something? I had the guy from the Tea Party, and now I have you. You're saying a lot of the same things.
Yeah.
You agree?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at what populism really is, and it always has been. You go back to William Jennings Bryan,
Yeah.
It's been the same thing. It's a distrust of elites. It's a sort of feeling of working on behalf of the people against the established order of the very powerful. And sure, there can be some differences in what you want to do. I'm quite certain that Bernie Sanders wants to socialize the country a lot more than, say, Donald Trump does.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the focus on the worker, the trade stuff is very similar. There's so many attitudinal similarities, which are fascinating. And one of the things that I found the most fascinating about Donald Trump's rise, especially this second time winning and being in office again, has been to watch people like Bernie Sanders and discover how much they actually believe in what they were saying all along. Because pre-2019-20, Bernie Sanders sounded exactly like Donald Trump on trade. Tariffs are the greatest thing in the world.
Yeah.
We need a ring tariff around the whole country. We've got to bring American jobs back. It was almost identical. He still says some of it, but now that Donald Trump's in office and he's actually doing those things, you're getting the tribal reaction, which is that guy's doing something, I don't like it.
Yeah.
And now Bernie Sanders almost sounds like a free trader, which is bizarre to me. So trying to figure out, this is kind of what I'm getting at, which is that these people are all sort of trying to figure out what they now believe or what they're supposed to believe in public. And what do they say? The political leaders never really have much of an ideology. They just follow the voters around. And right now, Donald Trump and populism and nationalism on the right has defined it. So now the Democrats are defining themselves as whatever it isn't on the other side.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that if Bernie Sanders had won in 2016 and Donald Trump had lost and we had President Sanders, the Democrats would probably be the populists with all of this trade stuff, and all of those things that he's been talking about for a very long time would be the identity of the Democratic Party, and the Republicans would be whatever that isn't, because that's just how we kind of operate. Tribes.
Tribal.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Donald Trump, like Sanders and like William Jennings Bryan and like other populists, they understand what these people who feel disenfranchised, who feel powerless, they sense it. Trump's a salesman. Look, he's a he's a promoter and a salesman, and wasn't a politician. But he knows these people, and he's going to give them. At least he'll say he's going to give them what they want, whether he does or not. But I said to somebody, there are a bunch of Republicans that I know, friends of mine, who they vote. They're worried about their pocketbook.
Yep.
The Democrats are going to come and take our money away. They're going to try to shift wealth, and which I don't believe, but they do. And he's going to lower our tax. The Republicans are going to lower our taxes, and Trump's going to lower. That's what they care about. But when it comes to the battle, if there ever is one, on an issue that is adverse to Wall Street and also adverse to people that have $70 million in securities, in corporate securities, and on the other side, the people that have nothing. And Trump's going to side with the people that have nothing, not the people with the 70 million.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not those policies actually benefit those groups, that's a totally separate conversation, and that's the world I occupy in policy and think tanks.
Good point.
But the funny thing about voters, though, is that sometimes it doesn't even matter, I think, because, you look at, if you go back to 2016 and look at the phenomenon of him winning that year, you had areas of the country in the sort of industrial rust belt, the Ohios and Pennsylvanias and Michigans and Wisconsins, the Great Lakes, those regions. You had so many people there that had watched their communities get hollowed out, right? The industrial jobs left, the good paying work is gone. Now their lives look different, their towns look different. I mean, for us, we could think of towns like Millinocket. I grew up in Hamden, so pretty close by, and I, saw it when it was in its heyday, and I saw it after its heyday, and it was a very changed town. And the people that remain there oftentimes are resentful and angry, particularly because nobody's talking to them. Nobody recognizes that that's happening to them. You had, for a time, the Republican and Democratic parties that were both clapping for free trade deals and thinking that everything was great with jobs being offshored and cheaper products and everything else. So to them, no one was their champion. So I happen to believe that just the act of being their champion and identifying and pointing at him and saying, I'm your guy and I'm fighting for you, even if it doesn't work out, is such a powerful connection between voters and someone like Trump or someone else that's like him. I mean, LePage, I think, had a lot of this when he was governor of Maine.
Yeah.
That even if the results aren't a perfect, result for you. You're
still going to put on the red cap.
Yeah, because you feel like you've got a champion that's fighting for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, even if it's not working out perfect. And maybe you're going to find excuses and reasons why it's not working out or whatever, but, we'll see as this develops. He's only been in office for 100 days, so there's a lot of administration left.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of, it's never easy for any administration. I mean, and you only have so much time. And in politics, as you know, if the Democrats take the House next time, if they should, but they may not, because they usually give a gift to the Republicans of some issue that will kill them. But if they do, you'll see people peeling off of Trump, politicians, because I don't need, he's not going to protect me. He's not my guarantee of re-election anymore. He's weak. He didn't get them elected, and they'll start peeling off. We'll have other iterations begin of the Republican Party, but you seem to think that the Trumpism will last a long time. The populism will last a long time.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would say Trumpism is going to last a long time, although it might.
Yeah.
I think the nationalist, populist personality to the Republican Party is likely here for several decades. I'm not sure what will really stop it.
You're looking at it in
it.
historical terms. You look back into the late 19th century and populism then, and so you see.
Well, if you study American political history, which I love because I'm a nerd, but there's about every 40 to 60 years, there's a new arrangement of people. They're called party systems. There's been about 7 of them in American history, and sometimes it's 20 years, sometimes it's 50, sometimes it's 90, but it takes a little while for the deck chairs to resort themselves a little bit. And when they do, that new reality usually sticks for a while. And the reason is because you have a successful politician and several smaller successful politicians behind that big one that kind of paved the way. So every Republican in the Republican Party right now loves the fact that they're a working class party now. They used to be so insecure about the fact that they were the blue-blooded country clubbers and the rich guys and the business owners and stuff. You know, they went with it because it was working, but it was something they were always deeply insecure about. They love the fact that they're the working man's party now, and they're winning elections based on that. And because they are, even if the midterms don't go so good, and Trump's going to go away in 4 years, and there'll be somebody else, I think you're going to see this style of politics in the Republican Party continue. J.D. Vance is likely to be one of the front runners for the next presidential election on the right, and those that might challenge him all sound an awful lot like him right now. They really do. If you go from Tom Cotton to, even Rand Paul, I've identified him as a little bit different than the populist movement, and he is, but on many things he's the same.
Now let's talk about structure now. Let's talk about the Constitution. Let's talk about rule of law, and let's talk about structure. So I want to, not trying to be provocative, but you're good at this stuff, and so I want to.
I encourage you to be provocative. Go ahead.
But so a guy that I had lunch with yesterday, who's a retired Maine judge, very bright guy, sent me an article about Curtis Yarvin. You know about Curtis Yarvin? Of course you do. You're in the think tank business.
Yeah, I think every once in a while.
So Yarvin, I never heard of Yarvin before, and maybe some of you folks have never heard of Yarvin. But Yarvin is a guy who's got one of those podcasts, and he's on social media, and he's a very interesting intellectual. So Mr. Yarvin argues that for most of human history, people have believed in a hierarchy of races and lived under absolute monarchies. This combination, he says, has served people well by generating efficient governments with missions that are the same as the mission of a company to maximize the value of its capital. And he goes on to say that beginning in the 20th century, we came into a period that is founded, he says, on lies. Lies that human beings are equal and that self-government by free and equal citizens is possible. Now, by free and equal citizens is possible, is difficult, he says, because human beings are not equal. DNA, he argues, disproves the fact that they are equal, and he said our current political situation of nobody agreeing on everything, everybody at their throats, disproves that self-government is possible. He's saying this experiment isn't working out, and human beings are not fit for this. I assume you don't agree with that.
No, I don't. I don't, no.
So that's what I figured. You don't agree with that. However, because you mentioned Vance, this guy, I then decided to go on the internet and find out all I could about.
It's always a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, I know. But he has a bit of a following now. I don't think it's going to last forever, but he has a following now. Anybody can get a following.
Yep.
And but Bannon is a pal of his, and his biggest pal is Peter Thiel, or Thiel.
Thiel, yeah.
Peter Thiel, who is the biggest promoter of Vance for vice president. So
he's a fascinating guy in his own right because he's a tech bro.
He's a tech bro.
Yeah.
That's right. And this guy hangs out with tech bros.
Yep.
So Should we worry about Mr. Yarvin?
No, I don't think you should. I think you should be aware of it. One of the things that I think is actually good about what you're talking about here is this stuff's all in the open, right? So these arguments now are being made everywhere, and we can see them and react to them, and we can think through them and respond to them. And you know, to Mr. Yarvin's point, there's many things in there, right, to respond to. I think if you back up to the 30,000-foot view, the cliched 30,000-foot view, I think the idea that the experiment of American republicanism is a failure and can't work is just tacitly false. It just is. I think that you look at I think he had a lot of things in there that were about like hierarchy. You mentioned hierarchy of races, right?
Yeah.
Things like that. Sometimes fairly disturbing stuff comes out like that. But when you look at where our biggest disagreements are in the country, you're talking about a lot of people who 50 or 60 years ago would have been on the same team. You've got a lot of white liberals against white conservatives, like working class whites in trailer parks against tech bros in Silicon Valley, right? Those people all would have been on the same team, if you will, in 1950, 55. So it's really less about, I think, race and geography and a lot of the things that many times these people identify, and much more about the natural progression of political battles. I think we're living through a consequence of the evolution of this country, frankly, technologically, in media. You know, the way that we talk to each other now, you're just talking about a podcast and searching on the internet for probably comment sections that the vice president was hanging out in, right? That kind of thing did not happen 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly not 50 years ago. And because the mediums with which we are dealing with each other are changing, it is exacerbating really bad things about ourselves. And if you want to look and point at something that's really at the apex of why the discourse has become so unhelpful and negative and mean and bad, I think a lot of it comes back to the fact that the human nature that you were talking about at the very beginning of our program, you know, us being the same as cavemen people, we weren't built for smartphones. We weren't built for the internet. And we're adjusting and we're figuring it out and we're living with it. And I think we will actually learn how to mature and use these things in a responsible way. But we're in a pretty dark place right now as we do that.
Very, very interesting. You mentioned racist or alluded to racist. When I was a young man, first I must tell you, when I want to respond to one other thing we talked about. The deck chairs have been rearranged. When I became 21, which was the voting age when at my time, and Eisenhower was president, I went to register go to register to vote at the town hall, and my father said, "Well, you can enroll in the party at the same time." I said, "Yeah," and I was a college student, and he said, "But you're in Cape Elizabeth. You're enrolling. You got to enroll in the Republican Party, otherwise you don't count for anything."
Isn't that funny?
Because everybody in Cape Elizabeth is a Republican, and
not to interrupt you, but did you know that as late as I think it was 2007. I have a rolling list of voter registration over the years. I think it was 2007 or 2008 that the first time that Democrats outnumbered Republicans in Cape, Yarmouth, and Falmouth. So pretty recent, actually.
That is interesting. Pretty recent. Yeah. So I actually became a Republican. I enrolled that day when I went to enroll. Now fast forward, I graduate from college. I go into the Navy. I go to sea for a couple of years. I then go to Washington. 1961, Kennedy's president. And the reason I wanted to go, I was an enrolled Republican, but the reason I wanted to go to Washington is I was a young person and I was inspired by Kennedy. He was an idealist, and that appealed to me. And I really got excited about it. So I went to Washington, and I had the great fortune of getting a job with his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, who was starting the Peace Corps. Just serendipity. And probably the first week I was there, the deputy director of the Peace Corps, who got me the job, Bill Moyers, who no one had ever heard of at the time, but he became very famous. He said to me, "Incidentally, Are you registered to vote? I said, yes. What party? I said, Republican. Change it. He said. I did. But that Democrat, all the racists in the country were Democrats. Mm-hmm. All the racists were Democrats. So you could count, if you found a racist, you could pretty much assume you were going to vote Democrat. Now, if I said the same thing about Republicans today, that all the I would first say, of course, most Republicans are not racists. Mm-hmm. I would say that. Mm-hmm. But if I were to say, as I said about the Democrats in the 1960s, all the racists vote for Trump, I think I would be right. But Republicans get very upset when I say that. Mm-hmm. But they would. Why would they vote for the Democrats?
Well, okay, well, you can get into a very fun conversation with this, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it depends on your definition of racism. I mean, if you go through the 2024 campaign, I think one of the things that Trump made the most hay out of and was the most politically beneficial to him was the general anti-woke, anti-DEI campaign theme
that they had. I agree.
When so much of that is about racial preferences and whatnot, and DEI as an institution is really set up to try to prioritize certain categories of human being over others, depending on goals.
Non-whites.
Being a little bit, descriptive, sure. Yeah, that's exactly right. But the point being that many of us find that deeply racist and reversed. So you have to start asking yourself.
But let me ask you a question. No, wait a minute. Now, I like you. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
We know why these preferences were set up. We know you weren't alive probably in 1964, but I was, mm-hmm. and I was working in Washington. And I've gone all through the South in those days and since. And I will tell you that white people did not have the same problem. White people did not have the same problem. So there's a lot of things to be made up for. 400 years of oppression.
Right, but Harold, I think the mistake you're making is if you identify that there are disparities in certain communities across the country, the question of how you deal with it and what do you do to make it better is a very important one. The way that affirmative action has attempted to do so, and many of the modern version of affirmative action, which is these DEI programs, have sought to do it, is not only not accomplishing the goal of really improving those circumstances, but is actually, I think, producing a counterstroke that is actually creating resentment, anger, frustration in people.
It is doing that.
Which I think is generating racism. So it's actually almost counterproductive in a lot of ways.
It is generating white people to say, what about me? This is a zero-sum game. If you're giving a preference to that person who has a different color skin than I have because of the color of their skin, then that means I'm getting less. It's a zero-sum game.
The most important part of what you just said was because of the color of their skin. There is a feeling, it's funny, talk to young people about this more than anything else. You say everything about people my age or yours. If you talk to a 20-year-old about this, they're the ones that are the most irate about it.
Yes, they are.
And it's largely because they have a feeling that the merit that this country is supposed to be about is discarded for superficialities to try to make up for very legitimate things, right? Having
you said make up.
Yes, but do two wrongs make a right? If racism is inherently wrong and bad, racism to fix racism is not A, going to fix it, and B, not morally justified. And I think that the blind spot of the Democratic Party to that very, I think, authentic criticism is part of their misunderstanding about Republican reactions to this. Because there's no question there's Republican racists. There's also no question that there's Democratic racists, and that their version of racism is very different.
Well, the white people that say, white lives matter. I used to see those signs too. So they reacted to the Black Lives Matter that way. Mm-hmm. Well, what about us? What about us? But they haven't, maybe many of them, and you said young people, haven't lived had the experiences that I've had. And so I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example that these kids wouldn't understand. I went to Princeton University, a very elitist university. 4 years there, not a single woman, of course, that didn't bother me. Not a single woman, no women were permitted there. And not one black person in 4 years at my university. Now,
You said Princeton, right?
yeah, that Princeton now. So
Go to Princeton today.
go to Princeton today. I'm very proud of what's going on there. I go to Princeton today, and it is extremely diverse. And I watched a 60 Minutes segment one time where the reporter went to Princeton and talked to the students about diversity. And they had a group of students, maybe a dozen of them, different colored faces, white, black, brown, whatever. And the reporter said, I'm going to read an excerpt from a book, like an F. Scott Fitzgerald book, but it was written by somebody else, about Princeton in the 1920s. All the wealthiest people in the country send their kids to Princeton. And they talked about the 1920s at Princeton. And now he said, what do you think these Princeton guys in the 1920s would think of their Princeton now? And a black girl in the middle of this crowd lifted her hand, smiled, and said, it's our Princeton now. And I loved that. I loved that because it's serving people that it never served before. And these kids who are at Princeton now and the kids who are at Exeter now, who are black, brown, whatever, who would have never been there in my day, those kids are going to have children who are going to have advantages and who are going to have paths that their parents and grandparents and great-parents never had. That makes our society better, in my judgment.
We could do an entire show on this.
Yes, we
I would
should.
I would argue back to you that there is a very large difference between correcting the brick wall that was in front of people that prevented them from accessing higher education and that high quality education of something like a Princeton or a Harvard and whatnot. And then setting the scales to such a degree that 50, 60, 70% of the population of these schools is made up of a non-white population or whatnot. Your goals are good, but when you think of what the academy should be, which is higher education, it should be something of great merit where the most qualified people enter. And when you put racial preferences in there as the defining characteristic of the thing that you're looking for, even if they meet basic qualifications, you are taking out other people that ultimately do deserve to be there. And funny enough, a lot of them are not white, Harold. I think when you look at what's been going on in higher education, the group that has been harmed the most by these DEI policies has actually been Asians.
That's what they say.
It's the truth.
No.
It is the truth.
That was the Harvard case. I understand it.
It's Harvard,
let me
Stanford,
tell you
Princeton.
something. But if my wife's daughter graduated from Yale, granddaughter graduated from Yale 2 years ago. So I went to the graduation. And you would not be sitting here saying to me that Asians are discriminated against if you went to that graduation and looked at the people, and most important, you talk about meritocracy, as the people walked up to get their prizes, the students, maybe 80% of them Asians, not blacks, Asians, meritocracy. So
For the people that made it through, but when you look at the statistics of
well,
the
you can't have
populations who go in there.
But you know, I once asked the president of Middlebury, who was a friend of mine, what about admissions at Middlebury? And he said, at Middlebury, we have an orchestra. We're always going to have an orchestra at Middlebury. We have an oboe player in the orchestra. We're always going to have an oboe player in the orchestra. They're always going to have a basketball team. They're always going to have a football team. So it isn't who gets the best scores always. At Princeton,
Then your academy is not the best of the best. If you're in an elite institution
Yeah.
and you're trying to attract and train the most highly qualified people, you're not doing that anymore.
That's right. You know, on purpose, they're not doing it, and they've never done it at any schools that I know of. At any schools.
Do you then deny, Harold, that My son is 18 years old, right?
Yeah.
So this is a perfect time to talk about this for
Yeah.
me because he applied to colleges and
Yeah.
has now made his decision and whatnot. But he spent the entire time he was in high school absolutely destroying himself for good grades, and he has
Yeah.
fantastic grades, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely qualified to get into basically any major institution in
Yeah.
the entire country,
Yeah.
and these elite institutions should absolutely be considering him. I know, and you know, that he has no chance to get into Harvard, Princeton, or anywhere else, and he has sacrificed weekends.
Yeah.
He has worked hard to do this, to get himself into a position to do it, and he's shut out. Given that, do you not recognize the resentment that is created from that when someone who deserves and has the merit to actually enter that, and again, I'm not talking about just white people, I'm talking about Asians who, again, are the ones that are the most harmed by this. When they are shut out in favor of others that are less qualified, it produces some of the very things we're seeing in our culture right now, which is resentment, anger, a resurgence of racism, and all of those things are unfortunate and unnecessary. And I would submit to you that if you want to seek to fix the problems that you're seeing with socioeconomics, education, all the things that are really plaguing the communities that you're talking about, that's not the way to do it. That's not the way to do it at all. Preferences that take out merit do not solve this problem.
Well, we disagree.
We do.
We disagree because there are a lot of colleges and people can go to whatever college and then if they have what it takes, they're going to do well in life.
Why isn't that an argument in reverse for
Because
anybody?
there isn't an argument in reverse because
Why does a preference have to give someone to go to Harvard?
Why does what?
If you're a qualified applicant
Yeah,
who is of any race,
yeah.
and there are quite literally thousands of schools you could go to in this country, why does someone have to go to Harvard or Princeton or somewhere else?
They don't.
Why do we not then just make the judgment based on merit, because they will all end up in a good place?
No, because that's not Princeton's job. Princeton's job is to create the community. It's a private university they wish to create. That's their idea. They have a different idea than you do. That's their idea. They think that the kids will learn more with the diversity. Maybe they will, maybe they won't.
They won't, though.
Okay, well, you say they won't.
It's a false argument, and you know that you know as well as I do that they're not going to be
then they have
producing
dumb people
the same
running
academic
Princeton.
rigor
What
that they would
say?
otherwise.
Yeah, but look, but I happen to like it. My kids, neither one of my kids got into Princeton, and I think Princeton, because of what it's done, is a far better place than the university that I went to. No question in my mind about it. And you know something? They could have a class, a freshman class, of all 1,600 SAT scores, every one of them, and all number one in their class if they chose to do it. If they chose to do it. They don't.
Well, then don't make arguments to me about the prestige of Princeton then.
I'm not making, I said it was a prestigious place, but I'm not suggesting that you should think it's prestigious.
Well, I think you're mistaking. I'm not in favor of the government mandating Princeton do anything. Although there is some questions about with federal funding being directed to some of these schools, to what degree can they attach strings, but we can set that aside for a minute. I'm just making a general argument about our society and what we're doing. Higher education deserves its own show, because I could talk for ages about all the mistakes that are being made there. You go to a college today, and Princeton's a fantastic example, as is Harvard, Columbia, and everywhere else. You have a monolithic, unified culture that is resistant and angry and frustrated at anything that's not it. A conservative student that goes to Harvard or Princeton today...
I'm not defending that. But believe me, listen, no, I'm not defending that. We're now talking about diversity in the university. I'm not defending, I have a lot of problems with the way the students act, believe me. I have a lot of problems with DEI. I do. What I'm talking about is diversity and how we got diversity in a school where there was zero diversity.
But that isn't how you got it. That didn't come because of affirmative action. That came because of social change that took place over the course of decades. You look at Princeton in, say, 1980. Okay, I think we can agree that that was before the real heyday of affirmative action and DEI. It was not what it was in 1950 or 1920. It was making significant progress because of changing attitudes and the different perspectives that at first opened up things that were closed. And I think that that's a really important distinction.
We totally disagree on this, but we disagree on a lot of things. But that's why I want you to come back again. But Matt, all our time is gone.
Oh, no.
Yeah, wait, she just gave me the signal. Oh, it's not gone. Oh, we have time. I'm sorry.
We have a little bit.
So let's talk about rule of law. Do you think that the Supreme Court is ultimately rule on some of these cases involving law firms, involving universities, and if the Supreme Court rules against some of Trump's executive orders, and he says, I don't care what they say, where do you stand?
Well, he hasn't really done that yet.
I said if.
If he does, this is one area where I have the greatest discomfort with the current populist strain of the Republican Party and conservatism, if you want to call it that. I fight a lot with people about things like due process and the rule of law. They're very important to not only me, but to this society and this republic, and when you disregard them, you're asking for the whole thing to crumble, in my
And
opinion.
a lot of conservatives agree with you.
Yeah, but a lot of them don't. One of the things that I've noticed, especially in the last month, particularly related to immigration, right? Immigration would probably be the issue that conservatives care about more than anything right now. And the case of Garcia, the Maryland father, right? That he's sometimes tagged with, is an interesting one because in that case, the government did follow due process, but they did a couple things wrong along the way. Because of that, the Supreme Court ruled that they had violated his rights and done something wrong, and they essentially ordered the administration to make a good faith effort to get the guy back. They have more or less ignored that order from the Supreme Court. They are now flirting with that line, and I think they're over it, where I am very uncomfortable with the disregard for rule of law. And what I would say to most of my conservative friends who don't think there should be rule of law and due process for immigration cases, and I hear that a lot, Harold, I hear that a lot. Because they entered the country illegally, they're criminals, they're non-citizens, therefore they don't really deserve rights.
But that isn't what the Constitution says.
Well, I'm getting to that, and I agree with you, so we could be back to being friends a little bit here. It's not only what the Constitution says, though, but you have to explain to some of these people why it is like that. And they're all missing the forest for the trees, in my opinion. They're so obsessed with an illegal immigrant who is here illegally, who does not belong here, who's a criminal, who's a non-citizen, that they all say that person doesn't deserve constitutional rights. And I understand the sentiment, but none of them seem to understand that due process exists for them. If another gentleman by the name of Harold Pachios was a criminal, and let's say he was an illegal immigrant for some reason, and the federal government wished to deport him, and we had a system that didn't have due process, they could accidentally pick you up, send you off to El Salvador, throw you in a prison somewhere, forget that they did it, and just move on with their lives, and we would be in a lot of trouble, or you would be in a lot of trouble.
The phrase is, and then they'll come for me.
Right. But if you have due process, you can challenge it. You can make the government
We got to wrap up now, but I hope you're going to come back soon because we haven't covered it. We haven't done what I wanted to do.
Well, we could do a 2-hour show.
No, we're going to have another one. All right, well, thank you very much for coming in.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
We're going to have to talk because you're going to have to come back again. We have to finish what we started here.
Anytime you want.
But I am glad we get off on these things.